the SENS framework, entirely put together by non-disabled, white, middle class academics, really. The thing I found very interesting is that of all the people who were interviewed, whose opinion was asked, whose comments were taken on board, the group missing were the survivors of special education. Did you notice that?
Mm.
That they never, it never crossed their minds to go back to those of us that have had experienced their framework and asked us if it ever worked. Was it a good idea? What was the long-term effect? Because school, the purpose is to prepare you for adult life. It isn't about the actual experience of being in school, or it shouldn't be. The point is whether it resulted in the sort of improvements in people's lives that you would hope for. When I started thinking about the relationship between all these policies and the people that make them and the people who experience them, it just seemed to me that our voice was completely ignored. And that was the result of the very wider assumptions about disabled people and our ability to reflect and contribute to our own futures. It stemmed from the whole eugenic policies in which we'd all grown up, although we didn't realise it, in which we were all basically considered incapable. When I grew up in the 1950s and 60s, it was very, very common that people would talk to the people pushing my wheelchair and not to me. And that was a sort of culture within the able-bodied world that dominated people's thinking. So it was very clear that if you were either a survivor of special education or you're the parent, a new parent of a child whom you wanted a different outcome to what was apparent, the outcome of segregated education, which is almost always a segregated life hereafter or thereafter, and a divided world where non-disabled people didn't know us, had never listened to us, weren't friends, and had no respect, really. No respect for our thinking. And when we started the Alliance, it was after the Warnock report, when for the first time, actually, it wasn't mentioned in that previous talk, but the revolutionary thing was that you could get physical help in a mainstream school if you couldn't manage without it. Before that, you'd have to go to a special school if you couldn't get on the toilet yourself, or you couldn't dress yourself, or you needed learning support in the classroom. Suddenly it became possible through the statementing process that completely new roles within mainstream education were to be created. Learning support assistants, teaching assistants, bodies in the classroom that could give you a hand. That actually was the revolutionary idea. And parents who thought there was no possibility of their child managing in mainstream, suddenly saw that it could be made possible after the Warnock report, and were very, very hopeful until they tried to use it, use the statementing process, and realised it came with enormous caveats in which the right of the child to be in the mainstream, even with support, was still curtailed by other considerations, such as the cost of it, such as whether it would disrupt other children's education, and as whether they could actually meet different kinds of needs within the classroom. The reality was we had not achieved the right to be a mainstream education. And for many parents, it was an enormous fight, enormous battle, some of which they won. And we knew those children had now grown up and are living very different lives to the previous generation. It's been vindicated. But it has still not changed in the basic fundamental right to not be segregated. I think many of us, particularly those who've experienced trying to move from a segregated childhood to live out in the real world, found the transition extremely difficult because we hadn't been prepared for it, and nor had the people, the non-disabled people who were welcoming us, or trying to. They were uneducated in very fundamental ways. And we found that we had to do all that educating as young adults. It was us that had to do it. Nobody else was doing it. And it was an enormous sort of heavy burden, and not every disabled person by any means had the confidence to do it and would shy away from having to, and so would prefer in many ways to go to the day centre and the segregated activities that were laid on, where you didn't have that challenge. I was trying to think what made us successful, and I think we have been successful. Not in the way we would have wished. If you want to look at the figures of the numbers of children still being excluded from school, I think they may even be higher now than they were then. You know, so you can't look to those figures and say, wow, we did it. But what we have done is uncover the nature of the problem. And particularly when we change the language from integration to inclusion, that in a way highlighted or shone a light on what a profound problem it was that we were dealing with. Because, to put it bluntly, competition and inclusion are the diametric opposites of each other. They cannot exist side by side. They just can't. And it's, in a way, obvious. It's just obvious. And really, what we were asking for, maybe we didn't realise it at the time completely, was a completely different value system within the education system. And that it was to prepare a whole generation of people to create an inclusive life when they were adults, whether they were allies, professionals, disabled people, parents, teachers, you know, whatever role it is, that the common goal will be to create a more inclusive world. And in some ways, we've done that. And we did it not only by standing on the streets with placards, we did it through training courses, through working with parents, through taking the thinking of disabled people, particularly around the medical model and the social model of disability, which was our own analysis, our own language, and taking it ourselves, getting on the platform and doing the educating, taking the leading, taking the platform basically. And between all the parents, through the ALLFIE trainers, through disability equality trainers, many allies, and Richard Ruser and Disability Equality in Education, we had face-to-face interaction with thousands of people over a period of about 10 years. And I mean thousands of people. I think that is what's changed people. They had direct experience of learning from disabled people, and the result, the long-term effect of segregation was shattered in that moment, because they made a connection with a real person, and they respected us, and they learned from us, and it changed everything. And many people became allies through that process. We also used the other channels, the legal channels. We went to Parliament, we had the early day motion, we challenged the legal framework and had some success with that. We did it together, collaboratively, and we attempted in many ways to model inclusion. I remember in particular going to conferences with our children, our disabled children who are in mainstream schools, and their friends, and them writing skits and doing performances and carrying out their own campaigns and setting up their own organisation, Young and Powerful, which was about the power of friendship, collaboration, crossing these barriers, working together. And it was what they wanted. It was so clear. It was what they wanted. And it was a very persuasive and powerful argument. Changed many people's perception. Looking back now, I think two things. One is that inclusion is what everybody wants in their hearts, because in the end it's about them when they grow old. It's about the sort of world we know we want. And the problem still is lack of information and education and segregation, actually. Lack of contact, lack of meaningful connection. And that battle has to continue, and the battle for inclusion has to continue. We have to be the leaders of it, because without it, the world is heading in a very, very dangerous direction, as we all know. And the only solution is to work together and to not build a world based on competition, but collaboration.